It's easy to think of Roman emperors as omnipotent rulers that could and did whatever struck their fancy, but as we've seen so far on this podcast, the truth was far more complex. The Senate wasn't in charge anymore, but they still needed managing. The soldiers, especially the Praetorian Guard, were a source of power, but they had also shown that they could topple emperors. And in the reign of Claudius, we see a third group that could both support and direct the emperor. Members of his own household, that is, the family of the emperor, especially women, mothers, daughters, sisters, may not have had formal political power, but they had proximity, access, and influence. Between this proximity and their own dynastic credentials, imperial women could be used by emperors, but they could also use emperors as proxies for their own ambitions. And one of the best at this was Agrippina. Her story starts on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 16, Death Becomes Her. Agrippina, at least as surviving sources present her, is not a moral person. Bodies piled up around her, and these deaths conveniently elevated her and also her son. Our main sources for this period seem to both admire Agrippina but also vilify her at the same time. So this brings up a question. Was she as evil and conniving as our sources say? Well, if she was effective at wielding hard or maybe soft political power, our sources would still have struggled to understand her as a female leader. Politics in the Roman Empire was squarely the domain of men, and we don't have her own perspective on her own life. Agrippina did write a memoir, but it did not survive, and so we only have what we have. But I'll help us sort through that as we go along. First, Agrippina brought an impressive dynastic pedigree, at least equal to that of her late brother Caligula. She was the great-granddaughter of Mark Antony and Augustus's daughter Octavia. This was through her father's side, her father being Germanicus, and she was the great-granddaughter directly of Augustus through her mother. It goes without saying that she was the sister of the last emperor Caligula, and she was the niece of the current emperor Claudius. And her son would grow up to become the emperor Nero. So Agrippina is actually linked directly to every single emperor in the first imperial Roman dynasty. This, by the way, is called the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Agrippina's childhood was defined by tragedy and also trauma. At age 4, her father Germanicus was murdered. You might remember, he was a wildly popular general and once the heir apparent of the second Roman emperor Tiberius. Her mother, who was also named Agrippina, so the mother was Agrippina the Elder, and then Agrippina that we're talking about was Agrippina the Younger. So her mother was, according to our sources, strict, proud, and she hated Tiberius. This was an overbearing woman with a wicked temper. And under Tiberius, she was tried for treason, found guilty, and then exiled to an island where she starved to death in AD 33. We talked about that, by the way, on episode 10, if you want to go back and check that out. Then at age 13, in AD 28, Agrippina was married off to a cruel old senator, a man who supposedly ran over a child once in his chariot. Agrippina, by the way, was this man's cousin, once removed, and it was around this age 13, that she may have been abused by her own brother Caligula. Around the time that Caligula became emperor, this was AD 37, Agrippina gave birth to her first son. And this boy was named after his father, but he would later come to be known as Nero, and so I'll just go ahead and use that name now, even though he doesn't get named Nero until much later. But the name changes can be confusing, so we're just going to go with Nero. You can thank me later. But before Nero was 3 years old, his mother got caught up in a plot to murder her brother Caligula. And Agrippina was exiled to an island, and during that time, her husband died. A third of his estate was supposed to go to his son Nero, which she would of course have access to because he was too young, but Caligula actually stole it. So Agrippina was both exiled, she was also poor. But then just a year or two later, Caligula was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard, and we talked about that on episode 13, which you might want to listen to. The new emperor was her uncle Claudius, and so she was recalled back from exile, and her fortune was restored. Now, why was this? Well, Agrippina was a free agent. She wasn't married, and Claudius could use her pedigree for his purposes, marry her off to an influential senator in exchange for support. And that's what he did almost immediately. He married her to a wealthy senator who had served twice as consul. At this point, you could make the case that Agrippina became the second most powerful woman in the Roman Empire. And the only woman she was second to was Messalina, Claudius's wife. Beginning a few years later, in AD 43, the deaths start piling up. Our sources often assign blame to one of the two women, usually because of who the deaths benefited. They either benefited Messalina and her husband Claudius, or Agrippina and her son Nero. So, just to give you an example of this, because there are so many deaths, we just can't list them all. In AD 47, Agrippina's old and very wealthy husband died of poison. Now, in his will, he stipulated that his entire state was to fall to Agrippina's son Nero. Now, maybe the death was a coincidence, but it would be one of many deaths that would benefit Agrippina or Nero. A second consequence of the death, by the way, of Agrippina's husband was that she was now a free agent once again, and her connection to the imperial family, and that she was still well within childbearing age in her late 20s, made her once again a valuable bargaining chip for Claudius. But who was he going to marry his niece off to? While Claudius was deciding, Agrippina was reportedly having liaisons with men well beneath her station, including former slaves. But why was she doing this? She wasn't pursuing these relationships for pleasure. You got to remember from the last episode, Claudius did not rely on senators, but the closest people to him were his own former slaves. And it was these low-status men who had the greatest access to the emperor. So was Agrippina sleeping with them to get her ideas and schemes to actually come out of their mouths? And was she laying the groundwork for an even grander plan than just simply marrying yet another senator? Well, while Agrippina was scheming in this way, Claudius's wife, Messalina, was also sleeping around. But the way she's portrayed in the sources is not clever and calculated like Agrippina. She's portrayed as a kind of unhinged nymphomaniac. She spent lavish amounts of money on frivolities, luxuries, and especially parties. She gathered around her her own court of sycophants and boy toys, many of them senators. I really am doing my best to keep all of this PG, folks. Now, that's the story of the source material. But historians wonder if Messalina was less just a wanton wench and more a pawn of Claudius, that Claudius was actually using her as a honeypot to trap men who he thought the Senate might try to set up as alternative emperors. And as we know from last time, the Senate hated Claudius, and they only tolerated him as emperor because the Praetorian Guard had backed him. They would have loved to have someone else. So it wasn't hard to imagine him deciding that his best defense against the Senate was actually a good offense, and his secret weapon in all of this was actually his own wife. Claudius killed Messalina's side guys one by one, but strangely never prosecuted his own wife for her part in the adulteries. That is odd, to say the least. So if this theory is true, and I have to say, I think it might have been, that means Messalina was also a calculating woman. We see this in some other ways. She went after Claudius's female family members and also their male associates. First, for example, she implicated Agrippina's last surviving sister, claiming that woman had an adulterous affair with the Roman senator Seneca. Exile was the penalty for that woman, and then execution followed. Agrippina at that point was all alone. Messalina also went after the granddaughter of the emperor Tiberius. That woman had been getting close to Claudius's Praetorian prefect, and that was too close for Messalina. So she accused the woman of incest, and not long after, she was executed as well. There are numerous other deaths laid at the feet of Messalina, and some of them killed by Claudius, others at the command of Messalina herself. For the men, at least, these supposedly spurned Messalina's advances, and this got them killed. But in AD 48, just 1 year after Agrippina lost her most recent husband to a strange poisoning, Claudius unexpectedly changed his disposition towards his adulterous wife Messalina. And to be fair, this time she appears to have gone way too far. Her target was a man named Gaius Silius. He was a new member of the Roman Senate, and he had a career that was rocketing upward. Silius had a brilliant legal mind, and despite his young age, he was already designated to be consul the following year. He was the sort of man you could build a new imperial dynasty around. So Messalina pounced on young Silius, who was already married. He divorced his wife, however, in order to marry Messalina, and Messalina, of course, was married to the emperor. She couldn't just divorce him. But oddly, she chose to have a public wedding ceremony anyway, in Rome, while Claudius was just a few miles away, supervising construction of his new port facilities at the mouth of the Tiber. And so Silius now had a choice in front of him, and this choice was captured in a poem that was written by the Latin poet Juvenal. Quote, "Silius is the finest, most handsome member of the patrician race. Yet a glance from Messalina is drawing him to a wretched fate. Her bridal veil all ready, her regal marriage beds prepared. What's your decision? If you don't choose to obey her, you'll be dead before the evening. If you commit the sin, there'll be the briefest delay before what's known in Rome and the mob reaches Claudius's ear. Bow to her commands, Silius. If a few days of life are worth that, whichever decision you think is easier or more preferable, you'll still have to offer your fine white neck to the sword." That's Juvenal in his satires. This poem basically captures the catch-22 that Silius was in. If he went through with the mock marriage, Claudius, of course, was going to have him killed, just like he did so many others. But if he didn't go through with the marriage, he was refusing the Empress Messalina herself, and she might then have him killed. There was no good option here. Claudius obviously found out it was impossible to hide a giant public wedding and party in the middle of Rome. And Claudius made his way back to Rome. Hearing that the emperor was returning, the wedding was stopped, the guests panicked and took flight because they were worried, of course, that Claudius was going to execute them. And indeed, Claudius did send word to have numerous guests at this mock wedding murdered. But again, he left his wife alive. Claudius, we're told, then began to drink and enter a state of despondency. He was unwilling to decide what to do about Messalina. Interestingly, one of his freedmen actually chose to issue the fatal order in Claudius's name. Messalina was to be rounded up and executed, and she was killed right away. And when Claudius was notified, he was reported to have said nothing other than something like, "Well, just give me another glass of wine." And he just kept drinking. The downfall of Messalina, who had been Claudius's third wife, left a massive opening for the right woman. But who was she going to be? Coincidentally, there was a woman of impeccable dynastic credentials just sitting around the imperial palace without a husband. You know who it is. It's Agrippina. But such a marriage would have been illegal and immoral. Agrippina was Claudius's niece. She was the daughter of his late brother. She was off limits, of course. But then Tacitus tells us that a senator put forward a motion to allow Claudius to marry his own niece if he wanted to. And indeed, he did. Because Tacitus also claims that Agrippina had already been at work, managed to seduce her uncle. So it was just a matter at this point of giving official recognition to what had already occurred behind closed doors. But Agrippina wanted more than just a marriage to Claudius. She wanted her son Nero to be placed in the line of succession. It was on New Year's Day, AD 49, that Agrippina became Claudius's fourth wife. She had finally achieved the highest position any female could attain in the imperial system, the wife of the reigning emperor. Tacitus, however, says that Agrippina was not just Claudius's wife. She was actually the head of state herself. Quote, "The state was transformed, and everything passed under a woman's control, one who, unlike Messalina, did not capriciously tamper with the Roman government. It was a strict despotism with a masculine character." That's Tacitus in his Annals. Agrippina was the sole survivor of a family that had been butchered one by one over the course of 3 imperial reigns. Her father, her mother, her brother, and her sisters all met premature, unnatural deaths. She had survived tragedy and abuse and had now clawed her way to the very top. This was a tough and ruthless woman, and now she was in control of the imperial government. And she wasn't done either. Claudius may have been her path to power, but he was not the final destination. She had designs for her son, Nero. He was in the line of succession, but so too was Claudius's natural son, Britannicus, and that meant both Claudius and Britannicus would not be alive much longer.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.